Picture this. You're behind your favorite GM screen. It's your monk player's turn. He gets this manic grin on his face, and he says, I run across the room and I slide tackle the hobgoblin to the floor. You make eye contact with this dice-wielding menace, and he gleefully asks you what he needs to roll. But you have a problem. There's no rules for that. Or if there are, you don't know what they are. How does slide tackling work in a game where there are no rules about slide tackling? You've got one choice. You've got to rule on it. I'm Zeke from Knights and Knights Games, and today I'm going to go over 5 different ways that you can rule on the fly, and I'm going to unpack how each one impacts the feel of your game. Your first option is to find a similar rule in the game that you're playing and tweak that very slightly to work in the situation that your player is describing. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition and your monk player wants to slide tackle. Well, in Pathfinder, that sounds an awful lot like a movement called a stride in that game and a trip attempt. So you would advise the player that he strides up to the hobgoblin and then have him execute a trip attempt per the rules. Now, when would you want to do this? When you want an easy way to balance player creativity with the existing rules of your game. Ruling like this tends to support a very rules as written GM style because you are referencing the rules of the game and using that as the foundation for your ruling. The next option you have is to have your player roll an attribute check or a skill check, depending on your game. When might you want to do this? When you can't think of any similar rules, or maybe the rules of the game don't adequately cover what the player wants to do. You also might want to do this when you want a ruling that is simple and easy for everyone at the table to understand, which is great if you've got a new player at the table. This time I want to give you an example using the Shadow Dark game. So let's say your party's fist fighter in Shadow Dark wants to slide tackle a hobgoblin to the ground. You could simply ask him for a dexterity check. And you have a couple of options for how you could set that difficulty class. You could set that difficulty class as the defense or armor class of the hobgoblin, or you could set it according to one of the standard DCs of that game. Ruling this way tends to support a rule of cool kind of play style because it makes outside the box and over the top player actions very easy to understand and adjudicate. Now, with these first 2 methods, you have an additional option. You can modify the player's role by applying a bonus or a penalty or a cost. Give the player a bonus to reflect that they got some sort of an advantage or benefit out of their additional effort. This is going to have a side effect on your game. It's going to make your players look for those opportunities to think outside the box or play outside the character sheet, and they're going to be more descriptive and more imaginative with the way they play. This is the essence of rule of cool. On the other hand, it will also slow down your game somewhat as everyone's turn is going to take a little bit longer to complete. There are 2 common reasons to apply a penalty. One is when you think that whatever the player is doing is putting them at a disadvantage. And the other is when you want to preserve game balance. An example of that might be if a player wants to flip over an opponent's head and then whirlwind kick everyone within reach behind that opponent, that might effectively give them more attacks than they normally would be entitled to per the rules. So if you wanted to allow that, you might apply a penalty to those extra attacks to preserve the balance of your game and make it a little bit more fair to other players who are using the normal allotment of actions that they get on their turn. Costing the player a finite resource such as a hero point or action point or luck token, depending on your game, will have the same feel as applying a penalty, but it doesn't sacrifice the player character's effectiveness at whatever they're trying to do. So they won't have a lower chance to slide tackle the hobgoblin in the example that we used before. Next, I'd like to talk about the rule of 25%. This one's going to take a little explanation. Think about the character who's attempting the task and what they're doing in narrative terms. Think about what kind of person would be more likely to succeed at that task. Is this a smart person task? Is this a strong person task? Or a tough person task? And then ask if that character is that kind of person. Then assign them a 25%, 50%, or 75% chance to succeed based on your narrative analysis of the situation. If that character is the right kind of person to succeed at that kind of task, give them a 75% chance. If they're the wrong kind of person for that, give them a 25% chance. And if it's unclear, let it be 50%. Then roll a die. The die that you use doesn't really matter here, as long as the percents are approximately right. So just to give you an example, if your die is a d20, a 25% is a 5 or under, 50% is 10 or under, and 75% is 15 or under. And it works the same on four-sided die or on percentile dice. Now, when would you use this? This is a great tool for new GMs or GMs who are brand new to a system and they're running it for the very first time, because it doesn't require you to know anything about the rules of the game that you're playing. You can also use it to de-emphasize rules as written deliberately if you want to get your players thinking about their characters in narrative terms instead of as a collection of numbers and character options. The next method I want to talk about is letting the player's actions succeed without asking for a roll at all. You might want to use this method when the player is trying to do something that is very mundane, such as using a shovel to fill in a pit trap with dirt. You might also want to use this when there's no consequence for failure. Let's say the monk from the previous example was facing the hobgoblin in an exhibition match where there's no real risk of harm. This method lets you really lean in on rule of cool as a GM style, and you can also use it to support a particularly dramatic moment in the narrative of your game. The last method I want to go over is telling the player that their action fails and not asking for a roll. Now, why would you want to do this? The first reason is to curb rule breaking or rule bending through description. An example of that would be the whirlwind kick from earlier. Depending on the feel of your game, that might not be something you want to allow your players to do at all. The second reason is to strongly de-emphasize rule of cool gameplay, such as if you're running a very gritty style of game. There are two variations of this method. The first and perhaps kinder variation is simply telling the player that they are not able to accomplish what they set out and ask them to think of something else to do on their turn. This has the downside of slowing down the game a little bit. It does have the upside of being a little bit nicer to the player and can be a good way to help teach new players the game. The other variation of this method is to just inform the player that their attempt resulted in failure. So to use the slide tackle example from earlier, you would just narrate how the player character stumbles across the cobblestones attempting the slide tackle, landing flat on his back in front of the laughing hobgoblin. This can give your game a very gritty feel and can be a good way to hammer home that the world is uncaring and harsh. On the other hand, you don't want to use this very often if you use it at all, because it can be very frustrating to your players. All of these methods are valid. How you rule is going to have a big impact on the tone and feel of your game, so give it some thought. Which is more important to you? Having the consistency and believability that sticking to the rules provides, or having the entertainment value of having your players doing over the top and very stylized, very descriptive things? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to support your local game store, and I'll see you at the table.